Thank you. What I'd like to talk about is the whole issue of vehicle technology, both past as well as future. The first automobiles were invented round about the late 1800s. This is one of several different generations that were designed. Initially, they were steam-driven, but before very long, the internal combustion engine took over and steam disappeared. So this technology really saw the end of the horse and buggy era. It was a disruptive technology. 1896, the first automobile crash that's been reported. It's an interesting crash. The two occupants who were seated in the front of the vehicle were ejected and died as a result of the crash. The crash happened, by the way, at 20 kilometres an hour, fairly low by today's standards. The back wheel actually shred. You can see that in the photograph. And in doing so, the occupants were ejected out of the vehicle. So the coroner, who investigated this crash, found that the problem in the crash was obviously the wheel that had fallen apart. And the reason for it was that it wasn't made out of good English oak. It was, in fact, a German design. Read what you like from that. But he also claimed, and this is quite ironic, this must never be allowed to happen again. Interesting comment. If we go now into the 1900s, clearly this was the revolution, the technical revolution, I guess, that's driven pretty well most of what we know about private transport since. In 1910, approximately, Ford, through their wonderful production line technology or techniques, developed this vehicle, the Model T. In its time, it was really quite a productive unit, quite an important unit. But what it did demonstrate is that technology is really well and truly underway in the 1900s. But unfortunately, so were road crashes. By the mid-1950s, these are figures, statistics from our federal government, there were more than 82,000 Australians killed in road accidents in just that 50-year period. That figure, by the way, for your information, the dotted line shows the level of motorisation, the number of vehicles that are registered, and the top line is the number of people who are killed. And it's interesting that up until about 1970, literally the death toll followed the number of vehicles. In other words, the more vehicles you put out there, the more people you're going to kill. Just for comparison, the 82,000 people who were killed on road crashes was about the same as the number of people who were killed in world wars during that same period. Now, around about 1960, these sorts of statistics led our governments to start thinking about the need for better regulation of vehicles. And indeed, in Australia, the Australian Design Rule System, which you may know or not about, it's a system that specifies to manufacturers what level of safety they have to design in their vehicles, came into being. And as a result of that, a whole range of new technologies started to appear, not so much in terms of the vehicle itself, but in terms of the safety of those vehicles. Things such as seatbelts, and more recently airbags, and various other technologies. I'm sure you read about them every day in the paper. However, while today new cars are as safe and efficient as they've ever been, we're still killing over 1 million people every year somewhere around the world in road accidents. Over 1 million people. And to bring it closer to home, in Australia, during the 1900s, we killed more than 170,000 people in road accidents. These are vehicle accidents, they're not other types of accidents. So just think about that number, 170,000 people. Can you imagine what that would be like? If you're into football, for example, that's about 2 grand finals of crowds killed as a result of road accidents. So it's a serious problem, and still is. So what about the future? Tony Seba, the gentleman here, published a book recently called Clean Disruption of Energy and of Transportation. What he claims in this book is that technical development is being driven by disruption. Disruption meaning one technology is disrupting another, a previous one. He predicts that by 2030, all new private transport will be electrically driven, it will be driverless or autonomous, and you will use service vehicles rather than own your own car. That's 13 years from today. He claims that this will be the situation. I want to explore a little bit of that with you. We won't, he says, we won't own our own cars, so that reduces parking, congestion, and a whole lot of other issues, but it saves a lot of money in your pocket. He claims only 5% of what you spend today on private transport will be necessary if this model was to occur. But I guess the question is really, how likely is all this to happen? I want to go through each of those three issues that he raises because I think it gives us a greater knowledge. Firstly, the issue of electric cars, and there are many of them. There's just a sample of the ones that I know about. They are available, but they tend to have limited mileage. You can only drive them for a certain distance. Although, again, this is rapidly changing. The two in the top corners, the right and left, cars today, the Tesla and the new General Motors Volt, I think it's called, will promise you over 400 kilometres. So you can see that already battery technology is changing. Now, the second claim was that we'd all be driverless, autonomous. There are indeed a number of vehicles that are currently available in autonomous, or at least are still under development. And there's a few, but just indicative of the sorts of vehicles that are available to run by themselves. Are they likely to be useful? Well, there are trials currently going on around the world looking at some of the issues of running these vehicles on the road. In fact, there was one recently announced here in Australia by Transurban. But there's a number of trials. The longest one is the Google trial, which started in 2010, I believe. It covers 4 US states where people are allowed to drive these vehicles autonomously. In other words, without touching them. They have to have drivers in them at this stage in case, but those 4 states will allow these vehicles to run by themselves. It's interesting, they've now covered more than 2 million kilometres, and they've only had 12, well, they're reporting only 12 relatively minor collisions, much less than what we see on our roads today. The third dimension that Seba talked about was the issue of service vehicles. These are some from Europe, but we have them in Australia as well. Maybe some of you have already used a go-get vehicle or a flexi car, both of which are available fairly widely in Melbourne. Current estimates suggest that these vehicles by 2020, that's only 3 years from now, will have a market of around $6 billion and will have something like 12 million members around the world. So clearly, they are developing and people are accepting them. The figure in the bottom there shows what the estimate is of our current usage of vehicles, and it's as low as 4%. This is where the savings will come, because with a service vehicle you can actually increase the usage of that vehicle across multiple users. In doing so, brings the cost down. The question is, why would you want to own your own car when you can use one of these for round about 5% of what you're spending now? So that's some of the technologies rapidly developing, and I want to show you that in a video if I could.
Ride-hailing apps are nothing new, but cars that show up without a driver certainly are. Singapore-based company Nutonomy has launched a trial of what it says is the first driverless taxi service in the world. Members of the public are allowed to hail a free ride as part of the trial, and the hope is a full passenger service will be launched from 2018. And an even bigger goal is for the technology to change the way we live.
This is really a moment in history that's going to change how cities are built and how we really look at our surroundings. Much like the advent of mass-produced cars after World War II really created a lot of cities in America and around the world. Autonomous vehicles, I think, are going to change how we actually build cities.
An ambitious claim. We were there recently, and I think they're falling behind their timetable, actually. But nevertheless, it's an interesting display of what Seba was claiming a few years ago. I guess one of the other issues, of course, is, well, it's wonderful to have all this technology, but will people actually use it? This was a survey that was conducted in 2013 by a company, Cisco, I think they're called. And it was an international survey, so they looked across 10 countries, and they, apart from other things, asked 2 questions. They're up there. The first one is the blue bars, and that was a question saying, would you be prepared to ride driverless? The second one is the green bar, which I thought was even more clever. Would you let your kids ride in a driverless car? Interestingly, both of those questions, although there were variations across the countries, were relatively similar. So if people trusted themselves, they figured it was okay to trust their children. Now you can see overall the percentage was about 57%, so more than 1 in 2 people across those 10 countries were prepared to ride in a driverless vehicle. Interestingly, on the left, most of those, apart from the US, are relatively developing countries, and they seem to accept it much more than the ones on the right, which are essentially fairly developed countries. The US is interesting. I'm not quite sure why, but there's certainly a lot of strong interest in driverless vehicles in the US, maybe driven by the Google trials. But again, it's pretty strong demand, strong evidence that people are likely to buy into this technology when it becomes available. So, are they likely to be safe? We're worried about the whole impact of road safety. Our Australian government have now bought into this notion, or this philosophy, I guess, of a towards zero outcome. Towards zero says no fatals and no serious injuries. A fairly major, a fairly difficult assignment too, given the sort of trends that we're seeing in road safety. But nevertheless, there's strong evidence, not just here but elsewhere, that adopting such a philosophy may well give us some improvements in our attempts to reduce the road toll. So the issue is, would autonomous vehicles, the type that we've talked about, actually help us achieve this? Well, theoretically they should. These vehicles are fully technology driven. And we know one of the biggest problems in road safety is people making errors, human error. Will the technology be flawless? Maybe not in the early years, perhaps later on, as we get more familiar with it. What will happen if you mix, as we will, autonomous vehicles at the start with the current population, which are driver vehicles? Will drivers today take advantage of these vehicles, knowing that they will get out of their way? Are we actually fully ready for it? Do we know what being fully ready for it is? That's another question. Do we have all the information we need about these vehicles to answer some of these issues? Will they actually reduce congestion? Maybe they'll cause it to be even worse, particularly with a mixed fleet. So there's a whole range of these things, and we don't really have the answers for them at this stage. Let me tell you a little bit about a program that we're currently involved in here at Monash. This was really in recognition of some of the issues that we don't know very much about. We formed a consortium here at Monash to address some of these issues, at least the ones that we could address. So there were 6 departments across Monash University who put up their hand to be part of it. We believe this is fairly groundbreaking research. There's a lot of work being done on the technology side, but not necessarily so much on the user side or the societal side. It clearly needs, and we clearly have, fairly good support by the major key stakeholders in this area. It was interesting that we had a workshop involving these people almost 12 months ago, and for the first time ever, I think, everyone turned up. So there was clearly a whole range of concerns about this whole area, not just the vehicles, but what systems, what infrastructure we need to maintain them. I guess the aim of this program, at least the pilot study, is to try and understand what are the key issues, what are the things we should be really focusing on, because this technology is rapidly approaching us. What are the likely outcomes? What are the likely benefits or disbenefits of the technology? And that's really where I want to finish as well. In conclusion, let me just say a few take-home messages that you might want to think about. The first one is, despite what you might think now, or what you might want, there's little doubt that these vehicles are coming, and they're coming at a rapid pace. So we have to accept it. And what we have to do is obviously learn to minimise any negative effects of them, gain the advantage of the positive effects, and make sure that as a result of this technology that there's an improvement both in terms of safety, both in terms of cost reduction, both in terms of societal impact of these vehicles, and so on. And it's in that area, really, that we need our governments to be much more active than what they are today, because without their involvement, I'm afraid, perhaps some of the community benefits that they do offer, if properly managed with good business models, with good priorities, may not be achieved. So I'd certainly urge our governments to get fully behind this. Thank you very much.